Afternoon. Today's webinar and briefing session has been organised by the CLA, the Country Land and Business Association, to provide our members and some non-members as well with an update on the Oxford and Cambridge Arc situation. The Oxford-Cambridge Arc basically does what it says on the tin. It's a proposal to transform the arc of land between the great university cities of Oxford and Cambridge, but of course taking in that great arc a huge amount of members' land which is involved in it. The government has strong support for this work and is pushing forwards with MHCLG's work on the spatial framework, which will back up the Oxford-Cambridge Arc. The arc itself is a proposal to transform this stretch of land and includes, as I'm sure everybody knows, a new rail link, the East-West Rail, new housing and business development, and some in order to generate long-term sustainable economic growth. There are things which our members will find perhaps challenging in this proposal, and we'd like to work as closely as possible with MHCLG to ask questions of them at this very early stage. If people are particularly interested, I can't recommend enough reading Planning for Sustainable Growth in the OxCam Arc, and also looking in particular at the core principles of the Oxford-Cambridge Arc. Today we've got three people here to talk to you. We have Chris Krasnowski from MHCLG, who's the Portfolio Director of the Oxford and Cambridge Arc. He's going to give us an update on the status of the scheme, an overview of how it fits in with the government priorities, and detail some of the forthcoming spatial framework and how the landowners can engage in it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to then, we will listen to Chris's presentation, and then we'll give some time to questions immediately after it, before we move on to Tom Laffert from DEFRA, and finally to the CLA's Chief Surveyor, Andrew Shirley. So, Chris.
Thank you, Victoria. I hope you can hear me very well, and thanks for the invite for today's sort of session. So I'll just give a quick background on me and what I do. So essentially, I'm the OxCam Arc Portfolio Director and sort of head up the OxCam unit in MHCLG. I have two roles. The first is to manage the kind of wider OxCam Arc portfolio and how it docks into other parts of Whitehall, including how we work with local partners and local authorities, including planning authorities, in taking it forward. And then I'm also responsible for the MHCLG deliverables as part of the wider ARC portfolio, which includes the spatial framework and some of the work that we're doing to think about what we might do next in relation to maximising the opportunities of East-West Rail, amongst other things, and thinking a bit about how we deliver against the government's kind of ambition to kind of drive sustainable growth in the area through the creation of a ARC-wide growth body to kind of help us deliver on some of this vision. So I'll kick off by just saying a little bit about kind of why the ARC and why we think it matters, and then talk focus much of my discussion on the kind of spatial framework and what we're trying to do through that long-term growth plan, and obviously kind of pick up kind of where we've got to and what comes next. But it's worth stressing that we are still in the very kind of early days of this kind of policy, and as it's a 20, 30, if not 40-year kind of policy, there's a lot of time to develop something and a lot of time for kind of debate and discussion as we go forward. So next slide, please. So let me start by saying a couple of things just on why we care, really. So for us, the ARC is a unique proposition that we're trying to develop something that can genuinely compete globally in some of the kind of key sectors that the ARC in the UK is renowned for, including life sciences, and maximising on what we think are some really fundamentally strong assets across the kind of corridor, in terms of the kind of university kind of output, the higher education kind of story, human capital that kind of sits within that, and the sort of spin out capability that is kind of driven by the strong innovation and the very sort of unique and range of sort of sectors and sector specialisms that we've developed over the years. So for us, we think the ARC could be doing more, and we want to kind of make sure that we're equipping the ARC and enabling it to kind of reach its kind of potential as part of our wider agenda on levelling up and delivering on sustainable growth post the pandemic, but for the long run. So why the ARC really? So our hypothesis is that we're not optimising the economic, social, or environmental assets in the ARC. There's more that we can do to think about how we can optimise the spatial configuration of the ARC and draw on the polycentric settlement patterns that we have and how they're connected to each other. We recognise that there's a kind of uniquely complex institutional landscape with a whole range of local authorities, lots of kind of business growth organisations, and a lot of this leads to suboptimal decision making. And we think there's more that we can do to kind of to improve that. There's clear coordination failures on policy, particularly on kind of policy that intersects with the environment and infrastructure and sort of long-term transport and development. So there's more that we can do to kind of join that up, both at a local and regional and sub-regional level. And we think there's more that we can do to have a long-term focus to our investment and delivery pipeline. And this is not just kind of MHCLG saying this. I think numerous studies have kind of pointed to the same sort of challenges and failures and things that we need to do. And a lot of this is compounded by some pretty acute kind of problems in terms of policy challenges, that some of which are unique to the ARC, but some of which are kind of UK-wide. But in terms of housing, are we building enough to meet economic demand? Have we got the affordability kind of part of the equation right? Is the spatial distribution optimal for the housing that we're kind of seeing coming forwards? And are we building kind of housing and communities that people really want to live in? On connectivity, those that know the ARC will know that the east-west kind of connectivity is hampering the sort of the potential of the area, and there's more that we can do. There's a strong reliance on the car, and in a world where we're thinking about net zero, having more than 2/3 of people using car as their main mode of transport doesn't feel to us to be that sustainable. There are huge congestion problems in and around some of the sort of key kind of centres of the ARC, and of course we think we need to think much more kind of holistically about how intracity systems work and how we can kind of move to a net zero kind of world. And then on the environment, we have a huge mandate to deliver against sort of a net zero sort of set of principles, but how can we make sure we do that, and how can we view the environment as an opportunity that we can maximise and utilise, rather than a kind of constraint on kind of how we think about the future. So there's a lot of work for us to do. Now, why a government-led approach to this? So firstly, we need to try and join up the way in which government thinks about some of these large infrastructure projects and thinks about some of the kind of how they sort of bite locally. And so only by doing that together as a group can we really overcome some of the kind of inherent challenges and make better kind of integrated sort of decisions. So we think it kind of makes sense to do that. And we think the spatial plan and a planning framework out to the long term is one of the ways in which we can enable ourselves to do this best. So we want to make sure that we're focusing on coordinating across boundaries, integrating across domains, whether that's the economy, housing, the environment, transport, or infrastructure, and then that we're getting the right scale, efficiency, and impact so that we can make sure we're making smart long-term investments. Now our objective really is to make sure that we can deliver and help make the area a brilliant place to live, work, and travel in for existing residents and future communities, that we put the environment at the heart of our plans so that we are thinking about green infrastructure, biodiversity, and environmental sustainability at its core, and that sustainable economic growth is the other kind of driver. And it's that dual key or dual kind of approach that we think is going to really sort of change the dial and make this more palatable to many people and deliver on that growth potential. And we want to do this differently, so that we want to make sure that we're working together, we're collaborating at a local and national level, and that we're working with a range of tools that mean that we are open, transparent, and transformational in how we think. So I'll quickly kind of just run through the next set of slides just to give you a kind of update on where we've got to. So next slide, please. So in February, we launched the sort of paper, the policy paper, Planning for Sustainable Growth in the Oxford-Cambridge Arc that Victoria mentioned at the start. I would encourage you to read it, but it sets out some of the kind of principles that are driving this. What it also sets out on the right-hand side is the timeline for us to deliver. Now we're producing a truncated timeline to enable us to deliver at pace, because I think sometimes some of these plans take far too long to do, and we want to deliver them when in real time. So we want to make sure that they're kind of worth doing. And then we're going through a kind of series of phases where we envisage kind of some very rich consultation, with the first bit of consultation starting in summer 2021, so quite imminently, and then working through over the next kind of 2 years to a point where we have a series of policy papers and then a kind of draft spatial framework that we will also consult on each of the different stages, to make sure that we're kind of listening to people and engaging them along the way. So quite a kind of truncated process, but one that we hope kind of keeps people close and keeps us kind of and maintains momentum on what comes next. The next slide really kind of focuses on how we think about some of those really important principles to kind of help drive where we go next, and what that underpin our focus. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'll talk about a couple that I think are important. That the first is very much around collaboration and being collaborative. So for us, it's really important that we are developing and shaping this kind of vision and future plan in a way that kind of meets local needs, including communities and kind of businesses, but also kind of enables us to maximise on the growth potential that we think the Arc has, and really thinks about that long-term position. And we want to do this together. We want to engage in people in a really collaborative way, so that we can make sure that those voices and those thoughts and comments and commentary are heard and taken into account as we kind of develop our plan. We want to look at the long term. So too often planning sort of documents tend to focus on the here and now and the short term. We want to take a longer term view, and we want to put it in place as a foundation for long-term sustainable growth that reaches across political divides and reaches across interests from a range of kind of partners, and we think that's important. We want to make sure that it's integrated. So too often these things too often kind of much of our work kind of sits in isolation, and we want to make sure that we're taking a kind of rounded view and trying to integrate them as best we can, particularly when it comes to major strategic developments that will come forward over the kind of future years. So we want to make sure that we do that properly, and I think most importantly we want to make sure that this is both sustainable and also evidence led, so that we're utilizing the kind of changes in evidence, understanding kind of what this kind of new frontier on net zero policy delivery will mean, and then putting in place the right sorts of actions and interventions and investments to really maximize that. So for us, this is hugely important. The next slide just captures some of the reasons why we think it kind of adds significant value, and I think here I won't say too much, but more to kind of point out that the Green Arc is kind of massively important to us. It's also a kind of hugely important feature locally, and the local political leaders have really signed up to the sort of deliverable of Green Arc, and would like us to put in place some really comprehensive plans. And our challenge to kind of colleagues in DEFRA and BEIS as well as ourselves is to make sure that we kind of deliver against that. Importantly, we're looking at some of the patterns of economic growth spatially, and how they express themselves and how they change over time. So we're looking at trends, we're looking at how sectors are changing, and we're trying to make sure that we really understand kind of what are the barriers that those sectors are facing, and how we can put in place the right sorts of interventions to unlock them. And this really kind of means that we need to understand some of the commercial opportunities linked to in the Arc, so we can really maximise on its potential. And I think it's worth stressing that this is also quite important from a policy planning perspective, because we see this as being something that is a national priority, but also a priority that is kind of devised locally. But by putting in place government departments around the table, we can ensure that the policy that comes forward will have the full support of Whitehall departments, their delivery agencies, and then be implementable on the ground in a way that sometimes local plans kind of fail to do. So it will be important for us to get this, for this plan to be found sound, that we have a kind of really clear pipeline and investment pipeline as part of it. It's worth stressing that this will not only have kind of national planning policy status to give it weight in the planning system and sit alongside the national planning policy framework, it will also have national transport policy status too, and will need to kind of plans prepared by local authorities will need to kind of follow in its footsteps. So this is really kind of setting a long-term strategic view for the future of the area, and the policies that sit beneath it will need to kind of come together to make sure they can deliver. The next slide, I'll just talk quickly about the consultation that's coming shortly. I won't put an actual date on it, but let's say it will be in July. But essentially, this is really about the vision and our vision that we've been preparing with local partners, and one that we hope people will kind of will respond to and sort of believe in. So we'll run the consultation for 12 weeks. It will be a much broader conversation on priorities for the framework, including how we work with kind of a range of organisations, businesses, landowners, local communities, and kind of real people in bringing something forward. We really want to reach beyond kind of the people that normally respond to consultations. So we're really keen to look at kind of how young people and others sort of interact with some of this. We're really keen to kind of get into those nooks and crannies where we can really find people that have like strong views that they want to be heard, but have perhaps been hidden from the system so far, because we think that, you know, that those are people that should be heard, and particularly from the younger generation, as this is a long-term plan. And we want to make sure that we're properly engaging communities and other stakeholders earlier in the planning process. So we have not written any formal plan for where we go next. What we're doing at the minute is really looking at kind of the vision and what we think might kind of help us shape where we go in the future. And this is really much geared around kind of where we want to go and some of the priorities that we'll want the spatial framework to pick up on. So we'll be asking questions. The next slide just really touches on some of the kind of early conversations that we've had leading up to this point, and worth kind of stressing. On the right is a picture of what looks like an iPhone, but it is a phone, and really to kind of stress that we're really trying to use a different approach to consultation, where we're looking to get as much information back as we can, but in a way that's quite accessible and sort of driven by the digital age. So picking up on some of the planning reform sort of mandate that we have in MHCLG, and really trying to reach kind of groups and communities that don't participate. So for us, it's been designed in such a way that it will sort of elicit sort of responses and be quite quick and easy for us to then analyse, and we hope people will use it, including yourselves. And then the next slide really captures the broader engagement that we want to do, which includes thinking through how we engage with residents, local partners, representative bodies, and how we sort of utilise the digital and visual content. So we really want to make sure that this kind of gives us a really good insight into what comes next. And I'll finish on the final slide, which is just to say this is just the beginning. There's 2 years worth of work that will go on, 3 or 4 consultations that will be part of this, lots of kind of face-to-face engagement when we can, and of course lots of digital engagement while we can't. But we want to make sure that everyone has a voice in this, and so we're really pleased to be invited today, really keen to hear your kind of thoughts, and of course when we open the consultation formally, we'd be really keen to ensure that as a group and as individuals you will have the ability to respond and tell us what you think and what you want. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Chris. Quite the whistle-stop tour. However, as you said, and I've said, you know, if people familiarise themselves with the document, they will feel completely engaged and empowered by all of the knowledge that's in there. Really, it sets it out very clearly. We've got a couple of questions I'd like to take now. I'm assuming that TB is Tim Brightmeyer, who lives in the very east part of the Arc, and he's really got a question about connectivity. There's been quite a lot of concentration on physical communications in terms of roads and rail networks, but what's being done about the very poor connectivity? What can this do for the poor connectivity in rural areas? And I think it's worth reminding ourselves that 88% of the land in the Oxford-Cambridge Arc is rural land.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria, and thanks, Tim, for the sort of question. So like, I mean, when we're thinking about infrastructure, we're also including digital infrastructure as well as environmental infrastructure and the sorts of things that we need to focus on. So we'll have to make sure that we have a plan in place to enable us to kind of bring, you know, all parts of the Arc into the 21st century, and some might say 20th century. But importantly, we need a plan for doing that, and we need to understand where the challenges are. So as part of this work, we'll be doing some analysis of kind of some of the issues that we need to overcome. We'll be looking at connectivity as one of those issues, and we'll be looking to put in place not only an understanding of what's working, what isn't, and what needs to be done, but also ideally a kind of pipeline of investment to ensure that we can deliver that connectivity for the long run to all parts of the Arc. And it will build on the DCMS policies to date, but we might be able to kind of take them further and do them quicker. And so we'll be looking at ways in which we can do that.
Thank you. And I've got another question here, specifically from Nick Verney, and this is the elephant in the room straight away. What role do you think new large-scale settlements are going to play in the development of the OxCam Arc over the next 30 years?
Good question. And I think it sort of depends really in terms of how you think about some of this. So to a certain extent, when we think about big strategic infrastructure that we'll be investing in, we'll want to make sure that where there are stations, that we maximise those stations. And so we look at them both from a net zero perspective in terms of reducing the current reliance on cars and looking at active travel and how they fit, but also how they make kind of great communities. So we'll want to kind of think through the opportunities around those to make sure that we can maximise them. And there'll be other kind of opportunities that come through the local planning system. So not everything will be done through this process, but there'll be other kind of opportunities that come forward. And I think there is some scope to do that where there is a strong case. And like any local plan, any big site that comes forward will need a really robust argument for why it's there and how it can be delivered. So we think that it will be part of that. But what I also want to stress is that we're also kind of cognizant that we already have some towns and places in the Arc that could grow more. And so we want to kind of utilise those first before we start thinking about virgin sites in other parts of the Arc. And I think that's important because it's the integration of all of these things together that makes them viable, not kind of doing random sites in isolation. So we need a long-term plan for that. And I think we want to kind of begin to explore where the areas of opportunity are and work with local planning authorities and developers and others to think how realisable some of those will be in the long run. So there's a lot of work to do. We're at the early phase, but I think there are some great opportunities. So I'm hopeful we'll do this properly. And I think what I would stress is having a long-term plan for this is a much better way of managing growth than the kind of piecemeal things that we've done in the past. And I hope, having spoken to lots of local authority leaders on some of this stuff in the past, they would agree with that. Even if sometimes it's a difficult conversation, it's better to plan for it than for it to be pounced upon you.
Thank you, Chris. I've actually got some 2 or 3 other really interesting questions here, which I'm going to hold back to the end because I think they will benefit from having all 3 people answering. But to give you the heads up on that, I've got a question about how this is going to be integrated with neighbourhood plans. And I've also got a question about a wonderful new railway link where HS2 and East-West cross each other, and a question about the contribution of landowners and land managers. So I'm giving you the heads up there, but I'm going to leave it so that we can move now. And thank you very much to our next speaker, who is Tom Laffert, who is just going to appear on our screens. And Tom is Head of Land Use Policy at DEFRA. And his session is going to just inform us about the very evident environmental elements associated with this scheme, including, although he doesn't claim to be a specialist, being a stand-in for another DEFRA member, biodiversity net gain, but water, carbon, and the opportunities and challenges that all of this offers to us as members of the CLA and the other non-members who are on the call. Thank you. Tom.
Thanks very much, Victoria. And as described in the introduction, I cover land use policy for DEFRA. OxCam is one component of my team's work. I also cover net zero land use change, nutrient pollution, and the kind of project speeding up infrastructure delivery side, as well as the environment side of planning reform, all of which I think come together in OxCam. Before we move on to the more substantive slides, I just wanted to pause here for a second just to recognise and pick up on the point that Chris made about how critical the Green Arc, the environment pillar of Arc delivery, is to kind of local consent, delivering on the kind of local objectives around the Arc. I think there's a caricature that Chris kind of touched on of Whitehall decision making as viewing the spaces between towns and cities as sort of empty space for development, when the reality, and I want to get into this, is that it has, and we have to think about the aesthetic and cultural value as well as the the many generations of investment in different land use choices across the land in the Arc, and the opportunities for different choices in the future. We'll get into a bit of the detail of that in a moment. Next slide, please. So Chris has described the kind of programme and consultation element of the work, and also touched on the need to see the environment as an opportunity rather than a constraint. And the only thing I want to say on this slide is that, exactly as Chris describes, my team and the larger teams in the arm's length bodies of DEFRA are focused on achieving exactly that, turning the data on environment into something that can be leveraged for better, faster growth in the Arc. Next slide, please. Great. So I wanted to start at the start and summarise the objectives that make up the environment content of the Greener Arc work. Now, there are many ways to cut this, but divided it into 4 components that those of you who've read the document that Victoria mentioned will be very familiar with. So first of all, the accelerating net zero component of delivery across the Arc. I think there are 2 ways to think about this. Again, picking up on things that Chris has already mentioned. There's the deep decarbonisation component, which is primarily building on the opportunity that we now have, having removed most of the carbon from electricity, and getting to the point where we will have removed all of it very soon. And then there is the second component, which is the more difficult one, and one I'd like to touch on in discussion if we can, which is the land use change challenge implied by net zero delivery. Now, those of you who saw the Committee on Climate Change's most recent publication on the 6th carbon budget, that's the emissions reduction that we're legally required to achieve by the mid-2030s, had a very significant level of land use change across England implied in that pathway. And that's not a trajectory from the 2030s, it's up to the 2030s from now. A very rapid rate of change that we simply haven't seen from the emissions reduction targets we've been meeting to date. So there's a challenge there to come back to. Second pillar, resilience to climate change. And if the discussion allows, I think there are 3 things that it would be useful from my perspective to pick up on. First of all, the question of heat and drought across the Arc, and how that is affecting decision making on the kinds of natural enhancement, land use change that you're looking to deliver across the Arc. The right trees, for example, trees that can cope with drought, extreme weather, and the rise of extreme unpredictable weather as much impact in the Arc as anywhere else, further complicating the picture of insurance for land use across the Arc. Again, lots of interesting things to pick up there if those on the call would like to. And third, increase flood risk. What that does to the development across the Arc, but also the effect that is going to have on land use decision making across the Arc. Third pillar, the environmental protection and enhancement component here, and how that becomes an integral part of green growth. So a couple of things to say here. First of all, about the Environment Bill currently in the Lords. There are 4 things that we may want to come back to in discussion on the Environment Bill that create the substance that sits behind this pillar. First of all, there's the 10% minimum biodiversity net gain requirement, which has now been extended to nationally significant infrastructure projects, some of which Chris has already mentioned. The strengthened biodiversity duty on public authorities, and the way in which that will strengthen and change the way delivery is done. Local nature recovery strategies, which I'll come back to in a moment, and conservation covenants. And those are all intended to deliver this nature recovery network, a national thing, which the network that we want to deliver across OxCam will be just one component, and of course sits within the context of environmental land management. And then finally, the maximising opportunities for investment piece, maybe the most interesting piece to come back to in discussion. I think it's an important question for how this project is run, that comes from the fact that the choices that have been made by central government, some of the choices that have been made on Whitehall, imply a pricing for land management choices across spaces like the Arc. But that pricing isn't currently realisable in the market and won't be fully realised in the interventions that I've already mentioned. So there's a big question from my perspective of what that means for land managers, landowners who are looking to see how they can stack investment propositions on specific parcels of land. So keen to understand from anyone on the call how that's looking from the perspective of a specific part of the Arc. Next slide, please. Now, I won't go on the slide for very long because I think Chris has given a lot of detail on the process. Just to say three things. So I think it's important to keep in mind that those national objectives that for which the Arc is a kind of pathfinder project, a space in which delivery is intended to happen faster and better across these environment goals, and in a way that is properly integrated with growth, that makes the green growth proposition real. To get to that point, we need to work through all the consultation stages that Chris has described, articulated in the middle of this diagram. And to get to delivery, there needs to be a recognition of who is going to be doing the delivering, and what the realities of overcoming those barriers to some very significant land use changes actually are in the bottom half of this diagram. Next slide, please. Now, local nature recovery strategies, which are one of the new bits of decision-making and implementation infrastructure that's coming in through the Environment Bill, are, from our perspective, the core tool to channel investment into that land use change that we're looking to see across the Arc and across the UK. Now, many of you, I hope, will be familiar with the fact that there was one of the 5 national pilots took place in the Arc, the Buckinghamshire pilot. That's now closed, and we're in a sort of lessons learned phase for that local nature recovery strategy pilot. So if anyone on the call would like to pick up on anything they thought about that pilot, if you were involved, please do post a comment about the lesson that you took from your involvement. I think that would be really helpful. Next slide, please. So very, very briefly, as Victoria's just come back on the screen, so I must be over time. I wanted to just say 2 things on this slide. So first of all, the point Victoria's already mentioned, that the vast majority of land, more than 70% of land in the Arc, is rural. This slide focuses on the fact that within the Arc, we do not just have the sort of 2 Silicon Valley propositions of the large cities. We have the huge range of small and medium-sized enterprises across the towns and rural areas. And I am from a part of the Arc, and my family worked in those small and medium-sized enterprises. So I'm very seized of that fact. And I think the important point to mention is that many of those small and medium-sized enterprises, unlike the headline of this slide, are directly involved in providing services to land management managers and farmers, or are businesses involved in those sectors. And so I would really like to touch on the question of what the business opportunity currently looks like from that rate of different and sometimes conflicting land use changes that are implied by the policy objectives in the Arc. Final slide, please. I think I'm slightly over time. I will leave it just with one comment here that it is important from a DEFRA perspective, but I mean equally from an MHCLG perspective, that we're able to be absolutely spatially explicit in all of the work we're doing across the Arc, that we're not considering there to be single solutions that work for all places across the Arc, that the water proposition, the agricultural land use change proposition will be very different in the areas around Luton to the areas around Peterborough. And that is almost a glibly simplistic point, but one that I think we'll have to work quite hard to make sure we deliver. And that is absolutely the focus of me and my team. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. That last slide was very interesting, and we'll be downloading those later on so that we can really inspect it with some detail, because it brings up actually one of the questions which maybe you could give us a quick answer from Michael Carroll. Is we've just published at the CLA our paper on water use as well, so it's very much at the top of everybody's agenda at the moment. What would you say briefly is one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest opportunities in how you're going to deal with this water footprint of bringing a much greater population into this area, and towards the east of that area, an area which is already quite seriously water short?
It's an enormous challenge, and one that central government can't shirk. I think I'm afraid I don't have the detail to get into the specifics, and as you said, Victoria, some of it was on that slide and we should get into it. And I'll say two things. One, this is already a water stressed region, and if you look at the climate change risk assessment that the Committee on Climate Change just published, there are some alarming shades of orange and red across the Arc for the rate of increased water stress, drought across the region. Now, that is absolutely something that has to be properly built into decision making about the Arc, and I think everyone would be honest in saying that that's something that government needs to grapple with, and it will only be through a proper understanding of land use change and how that is going to affect a water catchment, sets of data, and an understanding that only people on the land really have. And I think that's the second point, that the quality of data to actually inform decision making is something that we're going to have to work hard to generate through the processes that Chris has described, and make sure that we hold ourselves accountable to what that data is really telling us.
I mean, I think it jumps straight out at us with water that this is where having the water in the plan, in the infrastructure and in the spatial plan is going to be absolutely vital, because what agriculturalists will be concerned about is that this water is going to be sidelined away from their land use of it when they're already quite water short at certain times of year for their crops. So Tom, as you heard, there have been a few questions which apply to everybody, which I think I'm going to come back to, because I think we'd like to hear Andrew Shirley's perspective now. And I know that Andrew is going to, so I'm going to flag it in a positively Shakespearean way. He's going to talk as well about the formation of a CLA membership working group, which we can then use to really engage between land managing and landowning members and this OxCam ARC update. Getting the infrastructure and this spatial plan right will, as this is a fait accompli, only benefit everybody. So Andrew, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Andrew Shirley, I'm Chief Surveyor with the CLA, and I cover sort of infrastructure, development and planning. And therefore, this is a key proposal that's going to impact on a lot of our members. And I think the big question that everyone asks is, well, what, how, when and why? I think, Chris has outlined it's a 30-year plan, so we've got plenty of time. But actually, in reality, you know, the time is pretty close to try and line things up and define exactly what one wants to do. Could we move to the first slide, please? I think this is the government's ambition, which is taken from the publication of February this year. And I think the important one for me is to make this area a brilliant place to live, work and travel in. And this doesn't just apply to future residents, it actually also applies to those who are already living there. And I think the thing that strikes me is that we have to look forward and try and not think of things in the way we have in the past. So it's not huge amounts of suburban housing, but equally it's not necessarily sort of inner city type development, but there will be a greater density of dwellings is my guess, and the environment in between those settlements should be looked after better than it would otherwise be. So I think there's quite a challenge to actually look forward and think outside the box. Could we have the next slide? I think landowners and business owners who are looking at this have got a number of choices. They can either think that their land is going to go for development. It may have better potential to gain money from environmental management. Some landowners and business owners will not want to engage with the process at all, but it takes a lot of time and there isn't any guarantee of a fixed outcome. And of course, there's other opportunities that come on the back of what everyone else is doing, and I'll come into these. I think the most important thing for the CLA is that you keep us informed. You keep us informed as you go along with the challenges and decisions you have to take. That helps us actually frame our policies and our asks going forward. Next slide. Thank you. Development. This is going to be sort of detailed within the strategic framework, and we need to feed into that. I suppose from every landowner, the first thing you need to think about right at the outset, so sort of now, if you haven't done already, is thinking about tax, thinking about getting legal advice and surveying advice, and also working out, if you are going to go for development, what do you want to see? How are you going to achieve those objectives? And how can you actually feed those objectives in to inform the strategic framework? And then, you know, what sort of agreements, how are you going to deliver that development? You're going to develop it yourself, and in the majority of cases, the answer to that's going to be no, unless you're an institution. But you might want to consider option agreements, promotions, joint ventures. The main thing is to ensure that it works for you, and the development actually, you know, has a reflection on your input. So you might consider some sort of legacy schemes as well. If we move on to the next slide, which is environment, you may decide that you want to do development and environmental enhancement, or you might decide, actually, just let's look at the environment and preserve what we've got, improve what we've got. So it's important to look at your land, consider the options, to start with what you've got, what you can develop, what you'd like to see going forward. Do you want to look after wetland, for example, or do you want to go for rewilding, or you know, there's a number of options that you can go forward, and all of these will have tax implications as well. And I suppose the most important thing is to engage with potential funders, bodies that might offer you advice, statutory bodies, Natural England, Environment Agency, local nature partnerships, local nature recovery strategies, talk perhaps to the Woodland Trust and the Wildlife Trusts, because all those will inform your directions ahead and how you might enhance the environment. And then, of course, the big thing is, where are you going to get money from? And some of those might come from carbon credits, it might be biodiversity offsets, it might be other businesses and developers that want to invest in the area. And my view is, if you're proactive, you will seek out sources of funding and you'll find them. That often works out a lot better than waiting for the funding to come to you. But remember, the environment, you know, it's not just planting trees, it's wetlands, it's recreating hay meadows, it's a huge gambit, as well as, of course, looking after the water and the atmosphere. Next slide, please. Of course, you might decide that you don't want to engage in the process. It's too complicated and too difficult. But the most important thing I always say is make sure that if you don't want to engage, that you know what's going on. You've got an opportunity to influence what happens to your land. Quite often, things that other people choose for your land might be less appetizing. So it's much better to be engaged. But, you know, you need to ensure that you know exactly what's going on. And also realize that things will change around you. And actually, you need to protect yourself from that impact. So it may be that there's increased tourism and access pressures. There might be roads. Obviously, you've got East-West Rail, but you've got a lot of other things, you know, sewage plants, all those sorts of things that are going to happen potentially on land that you own. If you don't engage, you won't be able to impact on perhaps the locations of those. And also consider, if you are going to object to the scheme, how you're going to object. Are you going to object to the whole OxCam's arc, or are you just going to object to the way it impacts on your land holding and your local vicinity? You have to remember that obviously this is a government scheme, and there is significant pressure behind it, and therefore trying to affect how it impacts locally and impacts on your holding is probably going to be an easier option. Next slide, please. I sort of looked at things that you can do personally in terms of development and the environment, but of course things will.
We seem to have a freeze from our chief surveyor. Oh, you've just come back, Andrew, having been out of sound. So if you could repeat the last 2 minutes, and then perhaps we'll be able to move on. Not 2 minutes, half a minute.
Okay, sorry. Other opportunities with millions of new residents, thousands of new businesses going to be created in the area over the next 30 years. There's a lot of opportunity for retail. You can increase your retail offer. Office accommodation, business accommodation, even holiday accommodation. There'll be an increase in leisure and hospitality requirements. So this is something that, you know, all landowners with property have the opportunity to invest in. Next slide, please. Of course, there are other risks, as I've said to you before. You know, there might be an increased demand of access, a greater risk of trespass. The whole landscape is likely to change in that there will be new development and there'll be more investment put into the environment. There will always be a threat of compulsory purchase, either to deliver some of the development, but particularly to deliver the infrastructure. But clearly, the more that you can more you can wrap things up in commercial agreements actually means the development can be delivered much quicker than resorting to any of the statutory provisions. One of the things, I put poor communications here, and what I'm talking about is a lot of the acquiring bodies and those that make the strategies and the framework, you know, their main driver is to achieve that strategy and that framework. And I'm pleased that Chris committed to what he called a rich consultation. And I think that's all about trying to involve as many people in the vision and the framework as possible. But there is obviously an onus on individual landowners and also the CLA to engage in that process and make sure that the rural voice is heard. And all schemes like this, all programs like this, will require a huge amount of time. But then there is the prize at the end that you live in a, you know, a good landscape, and there is investment, considerable investment available. Next slide, please. As for the CLA, we will provide as far as we can foresight and advice to our members. We will be involved in the Oxford-Cambridge OxCam's working groups. Particularly, we've already been asked to join the environmental working group. We'll be there to help try and overcome some of the structural obstacles as we find them. we will respond to consultations. And I think the main focus here will be sort of the omissions and also the opportunities that aren't realised. It's quite easy for everyone to get carried away with large development, but there's an awful lot of stuff that will happen in the countryside between those developments that is exciting and does produce considerable opportunity. You want to make sure that isn't lost. Sometimes there'll be management of promoter expectations, so you want to get the development done as quickly as possible with as little obstacles in the way, but they have to be realistic about what they want to achieve. I suppose finally on this slide, compulsory purchase is always there, and what we want to do is ensure that it is only left as a last resort. So much more can be delivered by cooperation and commercial agreements going forward than can be achieved by the sort of the blunt club of compulsory purchase. Next slide, please. With this being a very substantial scheme, it covers 2 CLA regions, it covers 4 counties, 5 unitary authorities and 21 districts. So there is a need for cooperation. And from the CLA, it's important that we concentrate our effort where it is most effective. We want to establish a CLA working group to sort of guide our response and the way forward. And we are looking for volunteers between 15 and 20 members across the piece. And as I say, that is different locations, different businesses and different impacts of the scheme. I suppose the important thing is that they are engaged in the proposals, because that will help us steer our position and also highlight where there are difficulties and where there needs to be a bit of refinement. It is a long-term proposition. We're looking at 30 years. We're not intending to have lots of in-person meetings, but periodic virtual meetings when there's something to discuss, when there's something that we can feed into and where we need guidance. And I suppose the quid pro quo is that you'll be involved in the discussions at an early stage throughout, and you'll also be able to help us with our response as well. So that works both ways. The CLA working group will be important going forward, as it will sort of, as I say, steer our whole policy in this area. If we go on to the final slide, which has 2 contacts, Alison and Tim. Those are the 2 contacts if you want to volunteer for the working group. We'll see how many volunteers we get. If we get too many, there'll be some who are disappointed. If we don't get enough, there'll be a few people that probably tapped on the shoulder and asked to partake as well. But it's a big project. It's going to last a number of years. There is a lot for our members to get their teeth into. And there will be those that are very enthusiastic and those that are far less enthusiastic, and we want to make sure we capture all that breadth of opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If all of the panelists can come back on the screen, we are very full on time, but it's such an enormous subject that this doesn't really surprise me at all at this stage. There are far more questions than there are answers. And really, the working group and the consultation are the most important parts of this for our members, and I hope for DEFRA and MHCLG as well. I'm really going to gather together one question for Chris and for Tom, and that is really bringing together this idea, the biodiversity net gain. And this came from Rob Hopwood's original question about what land owners and land managers can do. How do you feel their best avenue for engagement can be accessed in the short term? I know you're going to say consultation, so we'll jump over that. And how do you see, just very briefly, their best way forward? It's a huge question, short answer, big challenge. So I'm going to ask Chris first.
Okay, I mean, it is a huge question. So obviously the obvious answer is respond to this consultation and talk to us. I think the other is to really kind of engage with your local authority kind of partners and really think about how we try and convert some of the opportunity areas and some of the policies that we're exploring into reality, and kind of keep abreast of what's happening, because I think, you know, things will change over time, and we'd really want to kind of make sure that we're giving everybody the opportunity to benefit. And this is not a kind of negative sort of development sort of proposition. This is really about kind of utilizing all the different forms of development that we can make, and to really sort of maximize and enhance the area itself, and that includes sort of biodiversity, but it also includes the environmental sustainability sort of principles. So for us, it's you know, it's get engaged, but try, and the spatial framework's going to be quite broad. It's a huge area. We'll be talking about opportunities within those areas, and then it's really a conversation that can happen with local authorities, and then, you know, as we bring forward projects and potential investment, engaging in that way. But you know, it's not quite yet, is my sense. But you know, you might want to lobby us on the things that we should be doing, and use examples from your land holdings and the things that you do to kind of convince us of the need for doing it, and we're open to that as well.
Thank you. And Tom, coming to you, I know it's a bit of a tough question because your brief hasn't given you much of a run-in, but G7 announced that mandatory net gain, biodiversity net gain, is now includes infrastructure projects. So this must have changed the way that you're looking at BNG for the whole project. Have you know, has it got a sort of a short-term effect and a medium-term effect for you?
I don't think it has a short-term effect. I think the main effect is it's now a bigger market that needs to be created, and you know, we were before that policy change, we were looking at a market with a value of just around £1.5 billion, and I think the opportunity here is to get ahead of that national market creation on biodiversity net gain, because the conversation is just more developed in the ARC, particularly the conversation around the infrastructure projects. I mean, as some of you, I hope, know, biodiversity net gain is not primarily a sort of broad offsetting proposition. It is about delivering net gain in the areas where the development is happening. There is also an element of it of creating quote unquote habitat banks, so large posts of land where it is more efficient to deliver enhancement, which can then, you know, has a price and can be used by developers to offset. I think on both those opportunities, both those within the space of the development, within the region of the development, and the creation of land banks, are areas where there are significant opportunities in the ARC to go first.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Andrew on this, and on the land bank. I have to say that I noticed in the document that there was talk of the NGOs and the Quangos being important partners in the delivery of biodiversity net gain, and very little, in fact none really, discussion of this engagement with private land managers. And I guess we'll always be encouraging you to look at how incredibly successful farm clusters have been as a way of delivering land management, high-level stewardship schemes, etc. But also that we have, particularly in your area, I think CLA has some very good examples of super clusters as well, where farm clusters have gathered together, and they have to be seen as equally, if possibly not more, efficient as a means of delivering this biodiversity net gain. Andrew.
Yes, I think there's huge scope where you can get landowners to work together for the much greater good, and actually that communication and that requirement. And I think you look at schemes like HS2, for example, which was lost out incredibly because of its poor communication and the fact that they've decided to reserve the sort of management of the environmental habitat very much to themselves. with greater cooperation, you can actually get a much better result. And that's why sort of having the links between the developers, the landowners, the requirement for biodiversity net gain, all sort of together actually means you can produce far more than you can just dealing with a load of institutions, a load of developers separately. The environment should be improved at the same time, or perhaps slightly ahead of the development, but they're very much dependent on each other. And the real prize is to get the net gain delivered, and the businesses up and running and their houses in the right places.
There's always a good moment to ask a bad question, or at least an unpleasant question, and I think it's sort of in the middle of a session rather than at the end and the beginning. And so I'm going to raise the spectre of HS2 right now and say, what have we learned about these now very public failures in communication between the body that was engaged to deliver a project and the people to whom that was done? And the very nicest thing we could say about it was that it was deeply insensitive. And in fact, I think the inquiry found that it had gone a very long way towards ruining some people's lives. So what have we, but that's, your departments are not responsible for that, but what do you think the departments will have learned from that experience when they're looking at this next infrastructure project? I'm going to go the other way around now, and I'm going to ask Tom and then Andrew and then Chris.
I think, Victoria, it wouldn't surprise you that I have no comment on the things that you mentioned.
Not on what it actually said, just what we learned from it.
Yeah, there are, all those, and I think you'd be hard pressed to find a civil servant looking at infrastructure projects like this who hasn't looked at those committee reports into HS2 and worked out what lessons they could learn. I think I'll say two things. One, I think everyone in DEFRA is seized of the fact that almost everything coming out of the department at the moment has implied within it a very significant land use change on a more accelerated timetable than any of us are used to. And that significant transition, which is national, is going to play out in the good point here is it's going to play out differently in different places. The important point is that, given that we're talking about the OxCam arc, is that a specific part of this proposition is that we try and do a lot of that faster, we iterate quickly, we learn lessons. And that is not going to be possible unless the process plays out exactly as Chris described it. And I think to pick up on your dismay at there not being a direct reference to land managers, I think that there's a hugely important lesson to be learned there, and a sign that perhaps those lessons aren't as baked into the thinking at the moment as they ought to be.
Thank you. And Andrew.
Yeah, I think all acquiring authorities or infrastructure providers are quite focused on actually delivering that, and that's the key emphasis of what they're trying to do. And there's so much more that can be done about understanding how things are happening on the ground. And I think, Chris has outlined, in his talk about a rich consultation. It's the ongoing consultation, and it's the understanding of what needs to be achieved development-wise, but also what needs to be achieved for the environment, and importantly, how landowners can contribute to that. And they've got a huge amount to contribute, and it's just trying to ensure those conduits are open. And I think, going back to HS2, I think one of the things right at the early days that was of concern is there were meetings with sort of local communities, and they were discussing what would happen on an individual's land. That individual had never been consulted. So it's things like that. It's really having that communication and having the right forums to exchange views and understand, from both sides what needs to be achieved.
Chris.
Yeah, I think Tom was very elegant in his reply, and I won't try and sort of match that. But I think there are a few things that we can learn about what we should do in the future. One of the areas is the sort of stewardship role that parts of government can play in order to kind of drive a different type of conversation. So the spatial framework we're creating here is setting in place that strategic framework for long-term growth, so that there are no surprises and there's a kind of consultation on kind of where the opportunities will be over a period of time. Our role in MHCLG is to kind of lead this project across Whitehall, and it's more than just the spatial framework, but also how we do the individual bits of infrastructure. And one of the roles that the sort of primary SRO will have for the OxCam Arc is a kind of wider benefits realisation strategy, and some of that also includes kind of how we engage and ensuring that we have open, transparent conversations, and there are no surprises. And I think there's something in an outside body being tasked with also making sure that those infrastructure departments that are leading on particular schemes really are delivering against the kind of promises that they've set as part of this wider project. And we all have sort of political masters, and we all have kind of populations that vote, so all of that matters. And I think one of the things we have put in place is to do some of that. And then the other thing is that this is more than just the sum of its parts. And so where we do get into kind of new infrastructure projects or new developments, and we want to kind of collaborate, we'll be able to get into a richness that I think our shift to kind of using digital and kind of open and transparent data to help us make decisions, people will begin to understand why we're taking the course of action we are, and I think there'll be, and I hope people are up for that, and sort of engaging in that type of conversation, and seeing the kind of the drivers of the evidence that as we see them, and we'll kind of talk about how we see them and how we're responding. So I hope that it kind of changes the nature of some of the conversations. And I would say there's a question on the expressway in the sort of chat that I just want to touch on as well. I mean, to a certain extent, we have listened to some of the voices around the expressway and the cancellisation of that project. And whilst the kind of comment does talk about the need to kind of think about roads more generally, which I think we will do, there are kind of better ways that are more effective for our long-term objectives around the environment and around growth and around connectivity than just building the expressway. And I think it was a policy of its time. It's no longer the policy for its time, and it was right that we kind of moved away from that. And I think that shows a kind of a grown-up sort of maturity to some of the debate here. And I'd like to think that it's good evidence of where we might go next. And I hope that through the schemes that we have currently on the statute book and those that will be coming in the future, we have a similar sort of dialogue, and we're really all aware of what's going on and why it's happening. And I think that hopefully then overcomes some of those challenges. Of course, we can't please everybody all of the time, so I wouldn't profess to doing that, but hopefully that puts in place a level playing field for everyone to understand why we're doing something and how we want to respond.
Thank you. And I think it's impossible, in my view, that somebody will feel altruistic about development if it's happening right in the middle of their farm. You would need to have an almost animal farm like messianic belief in the project itself to feel that way. And so I guess there's going to be a big plea in here from all of the organisations engaged in the collaboration that to deal more sensitively with those people who are so very, very directly affected. It's not nothing to be asked to allow, and then finally forced to be allowed to do some of these projects. There's a question in the chat bar, a quick one about airports. Now, airports feel strangely anachronistic things these days, but I dare say we'll start using them again in the future. And Thomas Wed has said, with the potential of such an enormous explosion in population in these areas, how are you going to move these people to Birmingham and Stansted airports? How is that kind of big infrastructure of the nation being bedded into this infrastructure project for OxCam? I'm going to ask somebody to leap in. I think that's a Chris question, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Let me. I mean, firstly, we would say that we have quite a lot of airports in the Arc, some of which are kind of commercial airports and some are passenger airports, and all of them are doing sort of great things. Luton Airport is obviously one of the passenger airports that we have, and so we'd like to think there are ways in which we can sort of maximise that. And I know there's a really big push for net zero flight as some of the things that kind of the universities and some investors are exploring, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to kind of do some of that. And where we think about alternatives, I think, you know, putting in place the right type of rail infrastructure and the right connectivity in certain parts of the Arc to kind of unlock those existing airports would make much more sense than us kind of focusing on a whole bunch of new things. And of course, we need to understand kind of how the pandemic and how the way in which we live our lives has changed, how that impacts on the sorts of needs for those types of for those types of kind of flight and other things in the future. So I think we should bear that in mind when we're going to go through this process. But of course, you know, there is an airport that we can reach, and a lot of the airports are reachable, if not kind of directly. So I think I'd like to think we're not focusing too much on airports. Is my plea, I guess.
I regard it as one of the few extraordinary conveniences of living in West Cornwall, that I only have to drive 30 minutes to get on a helicopter to the Scillies and feel no need to go any further. I've got a good question here from Charlie McNichol, which is back to DEFRA on BNG really. Net gain has been predicated, I think, on nearness, on proximity to the project itself. But it seems to me that this project will grow in such a way that you're not going to be able to offset your biodiversity losses in a way that is in that immediate area. And so it says, what are the degrees of remoteness, Tom? How are you going to deal with that? That question of proximity with biodiversity, net loss and net gain?
I think your members and those on this call are going to have a better understanding of what actually is possible within the Arc and what actually is possible within the regions around those infrastructure projects, those new developments. And I hope that isn't true, because it seems from the analysis to date that there really is a very significant opportunity in the Arc to keep the value generated by biodiversity net gain, because it's a government intervention to create a market, as I mentioned, that should be worth at least £1.5 billion, presumably a significant amount more than that. I haven't seen the analysis of the addition that comes from applying it to nationally significant infrastructure projects. I assume it is a significant addition, but I don't have the numbers. So point one, I hope that is not true, and our analysis, I think, suggests that it isn't. But other people on this call will know that better than I too. There is a statutory biodiversity credit component of biodiversity net gain, which does allow the market to exploit efficiencies across England and perhaps eventually efficiencies across the UK, though not currently in the policy, for the kind of land banking, habitat banking that allows an offset to be achieved somewhere where it's more efficient to do it. I think we want to look at number one as what we really want to try and achieve in the Arc, though.
And obviously there's a lot of sense in the fact that the people who are, in inverted commas, suffering, perhaps in the old-fashioned sense of the word, of allowing something to happen, we should get the greatest benefit of the offsetting projects. Andrew, have you got some views on these that idea of proximity, but also on upscaling these kinds of projects?
My comment was more about, whilst we got the overall value of the potential for biodiversity offset, is actually translating that onto the ground, and so that there is some transparency of the market and some understanding of what the market will pay for, because that enables people to make the judgment as to whether they want to engage or not. Proximity, I think you can get probably too hung up on proximity. Clearly, the further away it is, then the greater amount of habitat you have to create to offset that. But it's trying to encourage people to do as much as they can to create that, rather than do the bare minimum and offset part of it. So if you've got someone who's willing, who can invest in, in water, in the habitat, in the historic environment as well, that's you're going to get much more, a larger bang for your buck.
Victoria, you're on mute.
Sorry, I heard children running past my window and I muted immediately and responsibly and then completely forgot about it. I'm going to move us back towards upskilling and the educational aspect and the employment aspect of the project. And starting with really with Chris talking about that in general, and then coming on to perhaps what Tom and Andrew might like to say about how that's going to build in the new skills network that we need to bring about biodiversity net gain. There is a massive shortfall in the rural economy of people who can do the doing. There seem to be plenty of people who can talk about doing the doing, but not so very many of those who can actually do the doing. And in particular, we were alerted the other day to the withdrawal in some areas of a city and guilds qualification, not in sophisticated silviculture, but actually in planting trees in an effective way so they survive. So Chris has got the big picture, perhaps on this upskilling, and maybe his mind is filled with skilled jobs in technical electronics firms. But so if he starts with that, and then we move on to Tim and Andrew.
Thank you. So I think that's right. So I think what are we trying to do? There are kind of two components to this. One is we want to make sure that we're maximising the benefits from the research innovation and the sort of higher level skills that are created through that type of innovation, and then putting in place a workforce that can respond to that, and also enabling them to kind of make choices about how they want to live and work in a place, so that we don't lose the talent to, I might say, other parts of the country, although I'll be told off by the Treasury for saying that, but also kind of globally, because I think some of this is a global race, not just a kind of a UK race. So there's that first thing. The second is that there are kind of large swathes of the Arc that don't have the same skills profile as some of the kind of urban centres, and particularly the sort of Oxfords, the Cambridge and Milton Keynes. And are there ways in which we can kind of make sure that we can level up the kind of opportunities of those people that don't live in those cities to the opportunities that come forward, both in the kind of new economies, but also in kind of changing and adapting to kind of how we deliver what the economy needs in each of these different places. So where we think about the jobs that can be created in the environment, and as people might term green jobs, which I don't really like, but there are opportunities around kind of the changing way in which we use infrastructure, the changing way in which we build and develop, that we should try and maximise. And I think allied to that, there's also a way in which we think about supply chains. And if we take things like MMC, so modern methods of construction, there are different things that will coming on board that will need different types of skills to deliver. And I think there's an opportunity here for us to kind of make sure that we not only can we grow our own, but people can get on career ladders and get promoted and sort of earn more money as they go through their career. So we have proper trajectories for people to kind of benefit. So I think there's a huge opportunity in focusing in this area, and for us doing more, and then thinking about how we can unlock those kind of policies through the right types of additional support linked to big infrastructure projects, where we can probably unlock more opportunities for young people, more apprenticeships, and more types of qualifications that can help people get on. So I think that's kind of how we've been thinking about it, and we'll be doing some work with DWP, DFE and BAYS, and then the kind of key infrastructure departments to think through how that works in practice.
Thank you, and keep talking to us about where those this has been picked up by the industry's action plan already. This really serious lack of skills in these areas, and I totally approve that green jobs seems to suggest a lack of sweat involved. and we know that what these jobs will require to make it happen, to make this beautiful green Oxford-Cambridge Arc, is going to require an awful lot of people actually using the sweat of their brow. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Victoria. So your question is about the fundamentals of delivery, and obviously this we won't be able to deliver unless we've confronted the problem that you described. And I think it's important to acknowledge at the start that there is a reason why the government has brought back a delivery unit at the centre of government, and is thinking hard again about the delivery challenge is associated with some of the drivers we've been talking about, particularly on the net zero side. I'll say three things quickly. So I think the quality of decision making in the ARC is only going to be as good as the quality of the data, and a lot of those data are going to come from land managers, and in many cases people working on the land who do not currently have the capabilities or the access to resources to provide the data that can enrich decision making. That the things that we currently get qualitatively through consultation that we ought to be getting more regularly through a process that fundamentally informs decision, like day to day, week to week, month to month decision making. Second, the capabilities to manage land differently, the point that you were touching on specifically, Victoria. I think there are two components to this. I think one, the very significant challenge of understanding how it is going to be possible to stack different sources of revenue on specific parcels of land. There is a significant training and capability challenge there, as well as a fundamental communication challenge from central government and agencies. There's also the very fundamental challenge of undertaking the training, learning how to manage that land differently, as well to stack the income, but also to deliver. Because we're not, I think this conversation, land use change conversation, is often mischaracterized as a kind of land sparing conversation, moving from one land use to a completely different land use. And it's mostly about doing multiple things on individual parcels of land or areas of land owned or managed by individuals. And then finally, I think the way this is delivered in the ARC is going to be like, it's not like there is an option not to adapt, not to change. It's just things are going to run a bit faster in the ARC. So I think there is a real opportunity for the CLA to take lessons like the one you were describing, the unlearned lesson of the high level stewardship approach you had taken in the superclusters, and then to try and apply those in other areas, but moving a bit faster in the ARC. I think that would really help the work that we're doing. You're on mute again, Victoria, sorry.
So my surround sound grows as the afternoon goes on. And my plea in the middle of all of this: education is infrastructure. There is nothing more infrastructural than education. And actually, in secondary education, it takes very few years to bring on a new skilled workforce that isn't going to go to university, but is going to go straight into physical and technical work. I think it's something that the colleges would be very interested in. Andrew, over to you on the skills.
Yeah. I think too often we look at sort of the rural economy and the skills required for the rural economy, and that sort of comfortably sort of knits us into sort of agriculture and tourism, really. But that's not the case. There is a huge variety of businesses and employment types that can be accommodated in the countryside and are already accommodated in the countryside. So yes, we need to look at upskilling. We need to look at retaining people to work at home and work locally. And I think with coronavirus that we've had for the last 18 months, I think what it has shown us that people are now working at home more often, and they're around and about, and they're not all commuting to the cities. And it's trying to retain all that experience and build on that. But as I say, looking at a wide variety of businesses, and you know, that's the sort of skills we need to get on board, not just in terms of the green economy, but actually the economy as a whole. And I think, you know, there is huge potential now that perhaps we hadn't realised perhaps so much, you know, a couple of years ago.
Thank you. I've got one last question really for Chris and for Tom on ownership of the project. This is a question from Christopher Moore, and it says, who will have ownership of this project and how will it be realised? Will there be a development core like there is for Milton Keynes, monetary incentives, none of them insensitive, relaxation of the planning laws, what is the vision of the end result? So if we go in reverse order this time, perhaps to Tom and then to Chris.
If it's all right with you, Victoria, I'm going to just pass that straight to Chris.
Okay.
You're going to get a much better answer from him.
So that gives Chris the opportunity for a full answer.
Great, thanks, Tom. Much appreciated. So I think it's a really good question, and in fact, it's a question that the Prime Minister has asked us to think about, and we've come up with a response. And so part of that response is that my department, my Secretary of State, and some of our ministers will be responsible for. I won't say herding cats, but shepherding the kind of the project through its lifetime. There'll be different kind of choices on different schemes within the ARC. So what we won't be doing is taking on full responsibility for everything, but certainly where transport schemes are involved, the accounting officer for DFT will be responsible for delivering against those, and our job will be making sure that those wider benefits that underpin a lot of the business cases that come forward for big infrastructure projects are realised. So we'll take on responsibility for ensuring that, as well as putting in place that like long-term coherent plan that we can kind of deliver against. And then where we do think about major developments and those that are perhaps bigger than we might ordinarily have done, although you know those are quite a long way away currently, we would look at all the different kind of delivery options available to us to find the right mix. So if we take the East-West Rail stations as an example around the sort of the stretch between Bedford and Cambridge, I think there will be some opportunities to think through the kind of case for whether development corporations or different types of delivery partnerships would be fit for purpose, and we'll want to kind of put those in place. Some of those will then fall under the responsibility of my accounting officer in MHCLG, but like the whole project, the intention is that we integrate decision making. We're collaborating across the key infrastructure departments, and most importantly working with local partners, local landowners, to make these things realisable and real. And the one risk I would say to a lot of this is that it feels quite abstract when you talk about the ARC in the rounds, and what we're trying to do is to put in place that long-term plan, but then underneath it put in place a really kind of clear infrastructure pipeline that builds on the evidence and the deliberations that we have with you, others like you, and kind of departments and people. So for us, it's kind of putting in place the right architecture for that. And you know, the Prime Minister is a sponsor of this, like all of his cabinet counterparts. People are cited, and the intention is to make this a reality, and my department will be responsible for coordinating that on behalf of the government in the coming weeks, months and years.
Thank you, and let's not hope too many decades on all of that. Thank you very much, Chris. And it's so crucial that this is the bit that people engage with, as you called it, which I think is so correct. It's the architecture, it's the scaffolding on which the project is built. And if we're not engaged at this stage, it's going to be very hard at a later stage to adjust it to fit the views that we deliver. And it is an abstract notion coming to terms with this framework. But it's absolutely vital that the CLA is there and is offering up a working group that can articulate how we can work with that particular group. I'm getting my time's up signals coming from the organisers of this webinar, and you've just got a slide here to remind everybody that in the eastern region of the CLA, you've got Alison Provis and in the southeastern region, Tim Bamford. And I have to apologise that I think TB wasn't Tim Brightmar. I think TB was Tim Bamford, and this has dawned upon me as the meeting has gone on. And so I want to apologise to Tim about that. Thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you particularly to Chris Krasnowski, to Tom Laffert, and to Andrew Shirley for, putting this before us and starting to make some real sense of it, and also for fielding some rather uncomfortable questions. So as we close, please listen to our members' views. They are knowledgeable people. They're not necessarily NIMBYs. A lot of them will be very interested in making this work. Please remember that the rural economy is part of the economy. We have the lowest productivity because we're always forgotten. And just because I think everybody will want me to say, before we empower other bodies to deliver these projects, let's put some let's put some controls in place to make sure they deliver them in a way that both MHCLG and DEFRA are comfortable with in the future. So thank you to everybody, and let's hope we all meet again when at the end of the consultation, which we're looking forward to. Thank you.